Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. I'm Ben. This is my 2022 Gen 3 KLR 650, and today I'm going to try to talk you out of buying one of these bikes. So I'm sure you guys are in a hurry to hear all about the pros and cons of this bike, and I promise we will get there, but I think it would be a disservice to both you guys and the bike itself if I didn't first explain the type of riding that I purchased this bike to do, and also sort of what I expect out of the bike because of my past experiences. So before this, I had a Tenere 700. Before that, I had a Gen 2 KLR 650 and then a DRZ 400 before that. I've also owned a few other bikes. I've got a few in the garage. Currently, if you guys are interested in that, you can check out the rest of the videos on my channel. But essentially what I've expected all of those three bikes to do, well, I guess four, including the DRZ 400, which didn't turn out well, which is why I bought my Gen 2. But essentially what I want to be able to do is hop on this bike here in my garage and then ride it about an hour north to get to some pretty intense off-road trails. And if you guys have seen my other videos or you want to see my other videos, I can put a playlist down in the description for all the adventures that I've taken this bike on. I've ridden everything from highway to insane muddy single track that this bike had absolutely no business being on. But essentially what I want to be able to do is get on the bike, ride it on the road, and then ride it off-road wherever I want. Now, obviously, by both that description and the paint job that I've currently got on the bike here, which is a little bit of Langlade mixed with Lincoln County mud and some sand and dirt and leaves and everything else you pick up out on those beautiful trails in the woods, I think it's fair to say that I have a pretty heavy off-road bias. The tires on here are 90% off-road, 10% on, something wild like that. And honestly, I think if you were going to buy one of these bikes, the way that I ride it is the way that you're going to get the most out of this machine. I've seen a lot of people over the years, back when I had my Gen 2 and now when I've got this bike, saying that they want to buy it because it's inexpensive, it's pretty big. I mean, a big guy can pretty comfortably sit on this, especially with the Gen 3 now being dressed up like it is, like an adventure bike. It really does look pretty cool. It's not all that different from really any of the other sort of standard style motorcycles that are out there today. But I think that draws in the wrong type of person. I think there definitely is a KLR type personality out there in a lot of us that really make this bike mesh well with both us and our riding styles. But I think there are a lot of people out there that are not really ever going to be KLR people. And I think people that plan on spending a lot of time on the road really aren't KLR people. And I'm not saying you can't be a KLR lover or you can't enjoy a KLR 650 if you're going to spend 100% of your time on the road. This is a very fun bike to ride. But it's no more so a motorcycle for the road than a Honda Ridgeline is for off-road. It's not really gonna get the job done as well as other bikes or as well as a Silverado or something a little bit more purpose-built would in the truck world. It's just not really where the bike shines. It definitely could be your road bike, but I don't think it is your best option. To really appreciate this motorcycle, you have to get it off-road. The abilities that it has on the road and the abilities that it has off the road mixed with the price point is really where this bike kind of shines. I'm sure if you guys have done any research on KLRs, you've already heard the old adage that it's not good at anything, but it's okay at just about everything. And I think that is true. It's slow. It's really not very torquey. It's 650 cc's, but it's a single cylinder. And it's not a single cylinder in the sense like my Husqvarna 701 is a single cylinder. That's got a few more cc's, but is tuned very, very differently. And if you don't know anything about engines, I guess you really don't have to, but motors can be tuned either for performance or for longevity and reliability. And the KLR is definitely on the longevity and reliability side of the scale, where the 701 is on the exact opposite. And I do have some performance mods done to this. I've got the aftermarket muffler on here with the widest tip that you can stick in it. I've got the bike desnorkeled, and I've got an aftermarket uni high flow air filter, which is probably no different than the stock one. All of those things did seem to wake the bike up a little bit, but it's still a KLR 650. It's never going to be a Husqvarna 701 or even a Tenere 700. It just doesn't have the power. It's a slow tractor, thumper, whatever you want to call it, and it does really good at that. It's a great bike if you understand that and if that's what you're expecting. And I think that's why a lot of people will buy these bikes, think they look cool, think they are comfortable to ride, great big motor, gonna be lots of fun, and then they're thoroughly disappointed because it is a 460 pound, 40 horsepower bike that essentially undressed is really not that much different from the original version back when it was just a 600cc engine in the early 80s. This bike has not been changed in a very long time, at least not in a big way, until this last reboot that it got for the third gen here. We finally got a little bit more rake on the front end, which definitely makes this bike feel a lot better and a lot lighter off-road. It handles sand and mud a lot better than my Gen 2 did. I think partially the extended swing arm kind of helps that out too. It basically just gives you a little bit bigger of a wheelbase. Really just makes this bike the best that it can be without any suspension components or upgrades and stuff like that. Obviously, I have done quite a bit to this bike in the sense that it's a little bit more off-road oriented now. I definitely 100% will always believe that a bike with crash bars is much safer for the bike and for you off-road, and is much easier to ride off-road just because you don't have to worry about keeping the bike up in a bad situation. You can just jump off of it and let it go and not worry about it. I've personally pulled some muscles and done some dumb stuff on a big bike like this without crash bars, and it's just not something you want to do. It's worth the investment. It's worth the extra weight. It's just silly to ride around without them. So please don't do that. Now, I have also done some sort of road style mods, I guess you would say. We've got the raised up windscreen here. This is the stock windscreen on a riser combination with a GPS mount. I really do like this. I do have videos on that as well as all the other mods that I've done. Again, there'll be a playlist for all that down in the description if you guys want to check that out. This really made the bike a lot more nice to ride on the freeway for long periods of time. Obviously, all the fairings and everything else the bike comes with stock keep you a little bit drier and a little bit less wind fatigued out on those long rides on the road. But this, I think, is definitely worth doing and is certainly helpful. Also, I think makes the bike look a lot cooler. The other things I've done for road performance is this KFX 450 fender along with the Eagle Mike fork brace. I had a set of D Sports on this bike originally, which I do not recommend on this bike. It's just too big. I think they're a great tire for a light bike. They're not a good tire for this bike, so I swapped it out for a Motaz Rals tire, and I definitely would recommend the Rals front and the D Sport rear. Seems like a pretty good combination so far. Definitely a pretty nice bike to ride for long periods of time. However, anything with this big of a front end on it, and especially with maybe a front end that hasn't really been beefed up at all since the 80s, it can feel a little bit loose and a little bit wild on the highway. Even my dad's Tenere 700, which used to be my bike, if you guys have seen any of those videos, you'll hear him talk about how he's sort of unimpressed with how well that bike handles at 80 miles an hour plus. This bike, I think, is definitely fine up to about 75. When you're doing 80, it just feels like it's not really supposed to be doing that. I guess we'll leave it at that. This bike is, I think, at its best at about 55 to 60 miles an hour on the back roads. It's much more enjoyable from a wind standpoint. It's much more enjoyable from an engine vibration standpoint. It's much more enjoyable from just getting out and riding and seeing the scenery standpoint. You can ride this bike on the highway. I do it all the time, but it's not really where it shines. And I hope I've already scared off any of you that have aspirations of this being something similar to a Tenere 700 or a sport bike or something like that, where you can easily get the front end up in the air and just ride wheelies forever. There are definitely people out there that can do that. I can get the front end of this bike up, but this is not a bike like the T7 or my 701, where all you need to do is crack the throttle and lean back and the front end comes up. You might get the front tire off of the ground about that much if you do that, but otherwise you pretty much are going to have to either tease it up with the clutch or with some tricky throttle work. It definitely is a bike that can keep up with traffic. It's a bike that you can enjoy. It's much better to hit the throttle on this thing going around the county road corners than it was on my DRZ 400, and that is originally why I sold that bike and went with my first Gen 2 KLR 650, because it just wasn't enjoyable to ride to my trails. This bike, I think, is definitely a good mix of being a good bike on the trails that I want to ride, or a good enough bike anyways, coupled with how it does on the road on the way there. It's pretty enjoyable on the way there. It's pretty enjoyable when I'm on the trails. It's pretty enjoyable and pretty comfortable on the way back. I think completely stock, this bike is definitely more comfortable than my Tenere 700 was. I did swap the bars out on this just because I didn't really like the sort of swept back KLR stock bar. I also wanted them a little bit higher up in the air. Again, videos on that. Definitely recommend the setup that I have here, which is the Tusk fat bar conversion riser along with the Tusk chub bar in the KTM high bend. Really a good combination. Now, there are two things that I'm sure you guys have just been waiting with bated breath to hear me talk about if you've not seen my video specifically on it already anyways, and I, again, would encourage you to check that video out. I'm not going to get too in-depth into this, but the sort of, I guess maybe Achilles heel of the KLR, or at least according to a lot of people out there online, the infamous doohickey, which is the chain balance tension or something or other. Basically, it's a set of parts inside of the motor that adjusts a chain, which, just like the chain, the drive chain on the bike will loosen with time, so there needs to be some adjustment mechanism in there, but the chain essentially runs a counterbalancer inside of the engine, and a counterbalancer is basically just there to sort of balance out the rather violent single cylinder going up and down in there. It's basically just something that's gonna even out the vibrations and sort of help kind of calm the bike down. And it doesn't do an excellent job of it, but it does a fair enough job that the bike is fairly comfortable to ride. But that whole system in there can have some issues, and if you guys have done any research online, and I would encourage you to do your own research if you want to hear my thoughts on it. Like I said, there is that video out there, but just like any mechanical thing, it can and will have issues in certain circumstances after a certain amount of mileage. Some people will say that you shouldn't even ride one of these bikes without switching that out. My first Gen 2 KLR 650, I rode all the way up to 24,000 miles. I guess I rode it from 9,000 to 24,000. As far as I know, it had the stock doohickey in it, and I never had an issue with that bike. I did notice that things maybe did start to get a little bit noisy, and that could have possibly been things sort of loosening up in there. But I was never actually able to find out because somebody kind of, pushed the swing arm over about 6 inches trying to get into the Wendy's drive-thru, and I was apparently just in the way. So never got to see what would happen with that bike, but that one I did not have the Thermobob mod done on either. That bike did burn oil. I think it burned oil by the time I got it. It's hard to say whether or not it could have been attributed to the lackluster cooling system that the bike has, and the other term, I guess, that you probably heard by now is the Thermobob mod. And essentially what that does is sort of snip the radiator line from the motor to the water pump, sticks a bypass in there, and then that bypass runs up to the thermostat housing, and basically that just allows a little bit of recirculation during times when you're riding the bike and the thermostat is not open. And it also basically helps the bike get up to temperature a lot quicker. I'm getting into this a lot more than I should be, but on a single cylinder bike like this, it doesn't seem great to me to dump not super cold, but ambient air temperature liquid into a hot motor when that thermostat would finally pop open. And essentially the Gen 2 that I had, especially with the temperature gauge on it, you could see very plainly that riding this bike just down the road, it would run so cold that the coolant needle was basically just buried on the cold side, and then it wouldn't heat up until you got into stopping with traffic or slow moving trails. And then all of a sudden the temperature gauge would violently drop when it would dump all that cold antifreeze into the motor. Especially on a Gen 3, if you're going to add the little temperature gauge, you're not really going to save any money unless you're sticking some really expensive oil in here and it starts burning oil almost immediately after you own it. You're not going to make your money back in dollars saved on bottles of oil. However, I do have to say I very much enjoy riding this KLR and not having to dump oil in it like I did back on my Gen 2, because as you can see, I don't often clean the bike, and you can definitely get some dirt knocked into that fill hole after taking the cap on and off several times on the side of the trail. So it just makes me feel a lot better. I'm glad I did it, but I think honestly, you can ride one of these bikes without doing either of those things, and I think both of those things really do turn a lot of people off. And I don't necessarily know that that's a bad thing. Obviously, personally, I really like to wrench on bikes. I like to see what I can get out of them. I don't mind spending a decent amount of money making it into what I need it to be. However, I still have to say that I really was almost kind of turned off by the doohickey. I didn't want to buy a bike and then have to take half of the engine apart. It's just not something I'm interested in doing. If you are, that's great. Of course, you can pay somebody else to do it. But I think if you really just want one of these bikes and you don't plan on putting a lot of miles on them, I think personally anyways, for me, it was worth the gamble, both with my old bike and with this one. And it's turned out well for me. You will, however, hear plenty of stories of people buying these, immediately changing the doohickey and finding that there are parts laying in the bottom of the motor. So it is a real concern. I don't know if it's something you should be real concerned about. Obviously, to get the most reliability and the most peace of mind, it's best to do the doohickey and it's best to do the thermobob right away. I think there are merit to both of them. Now, if you do decide to place your bets on that original Kawasaki design for the doohickey, make absolutely sure that either you or your service tech is letting that system do its job during every oil change interval. Essentially, all you have to do is crack the little fastener that actually holds the doohickey in place, then give the case a couple wraps with a rubber mallet, snug that fastener back down to the proper torque spec. Over-tightening this definitely could be a reason that some people run into issues with this. Essentially, it's a very thin piece of metal, and if you over-torque it, it may never slide properly in there again. As far as other problems that you hear about this bike, it definitely does not have the best brakes. The Gen 2s, you can buy a larger rotor kit for the front. I have not seen one come out for the Gen 3. I think that definitely would help. I think some steel braided lines would probably help. I don't know, honestly, that I would feel like I need the ABS version of this bike, and this is the absolute base model here, so I don't have ABS. I don't have anything fancy at all. ABS actually does make me feel a little bit better on my 701, even though I feel like I'm a fairly competent motorcycle rider. But on this bike, it's just not really... It's just not really set up to be locking the front tire up or riding endos on the road. It just doesn't have the power up front. The back, though, I have to say maybe it would be kind of nice to have ABS on the road because it does lock up incredibly easy. Now, as far as the suspension goes, I've actually never ridden a Gen 1 or a Gen 2 without the sort of new edition upgrades. This bike and that Gen 2 are the only ones that I've ever ridden. This, I honestly don't know, with a little bit extra added weight. I couldn't tell you if the front feels a whole lot different. It feels okay, it feels good. It doesn't feel great though. That and the back both feel kind of bouncy off-road, I guess is the best way that I can describe it. I think the bike is definitely set up a little bit more for on-road riding and maybe some light gravel roads, so it's not gonna be great in anything real intense. It's gonna be comfortable on the easy stuff, but it's gonna be, well, a little bit awkward, I guess, with really bumpy stuff and running really fast. Not to say that I haven't done it. Again, plenty of videos of me flying through the woods on this thing. It's a great time, but riding right next to my dad's Tenere 700 with his bike loaded down with gear, this bike loaded down with gear, I could definitely tell that he was getting a lot less fatigued and having a much easier time than I was on this, just because it is, well, it's a budget bike. It's not going to be something that you can tune and adjust to really fit your riding. It is what it is. You can't do anything with the front. The rear end, you can adjust the preload, and then you essentially just have to be able to adjust the rebound with that, the rebound damping, because you're changing the spring preload. That's going to change how fast that spring can be shot out. You want to be able to keep up with that and not have it bucking you off of the bike. So those are just sort of adjustments that go hand in hand. It's not really anything special. It's basically just there to adjust for your weight. You can sort of trick it into maybe riding a little bit better off-road, but then it's going to be a little bit worse on. It's definitely something that I would say you're just going to have to either get used to or drop about $1,000 into to make it really ride right, both off and on road. This bike definitely could be turned into something pretty impressive. Not that it's not impressive already, but with just a bit of suspension work and maybe a little bit more engine work, I think this bike could be really good. But the thing is, there are lots of really good bikes out there now for just a couple $1,000s more. And if you're gonna go that route, I honestly don't know that this bike is gonna be worth it. I guess I shouldn't say that. I do know this bike is not gonna be worth it. I would not start down that road if you plan on doing a whole bunch of mods, unless you just really like the simplicity of a single cylinder thumper. And I don't mean from the standpoint of working on it. I see a lot of people that say that, oh, this is a great bike. You know, you can just work on it in your garage. It's not a big deal. You know, it's super simple, easy to do. You can fix it with zip ties and a roll of the duct tape. But the thing is, most bikes that you buy nowadays, you don't really have to work on. They don't build them like they used to. They build them like you're not gonna have to touch them. And I mean, if that's really why you're buying this bike, is for the simplicity, so it's easy to work on, I personally think you should just buy something you're not gonna have to work on. But I guess that's just me. I am 5'10" with a 31-inch inseam height, and I weigh about 160 pounds. This bike is currently set on the 3rd preload setting, and we've got a little bit different size tires than stock. I think maybe the back's a little different. I don't know. There might be some slight changes, but with my stature, I can easily get both of my, I guess, balls of my feet on the ground pretty easily. I can pretty easily flat foot while putting my other foot on the foot peg really feels pretty darn good. It's definitely a heavy bike, and if you've never been on anything this heavy, I think I would definitely encourage you to throw a leg over it and maybe ride around a little bit before you even think about purchasing one of these if you are anything less than 5'10". I think this is a great beginner bike if you are 6'5" and built like a linebacker. If you are anything less than that, this is definitely not a good first motorcycle. This thing is heavy. It's hard to pick up. It can be done. I am not incredibly built. I don't remember the last time I stepped foot in a gym, but I can pretty easily pick this bike up by myself doing it the right way. As long as it's not in sort of a bad, weird downhill situation, I think you can definitely get yourself into a situation where it would be impossible to pick up. But it's definitely something that is manageable once you have a good amount of on-road and off-road skills. But like I said, it's definitely not a good bike for somebody that's a beginner. I would really encourage you to look at something like a CRF 300 Rally before you ever throw a leg over one of these if you haven't done a whole lot of dirt riding, because this bike definitely can put you in the hospital and definitely break some bones. It's more than heavy enough to do that, and it's not something that I think is good for beginners. Now, as far as the seat goes on here, this is the stock seat. You can get a lower seat from Seat Concepts. The seat is fairly comfortable. If you're going to ride 3, 4, 5, 6 hours with some off-road riding where you're doing a lot of standing, I would say that the seat is okay, but in that last stretch on the way home, you might be a little bit uncomfortable. Also, if you're going to ride it for days on end, you might feel yourself getting a little bit uncomfortable. I think a Seat Concept seat is definitely worth investing in, especially if you want to get a little bit lower to the ground. The S model now is available in the most recent years of this bike. I think that is a great option if you're somebody that is vertically challenged like myself or just wants to be a little bit closer to the ground, especially if you're still learning. That's a great thing to have. I think that maybe drops your ground clearance a bit, which can sort of be a problem. I've definitely scraped the bottom of this bike a few times, and it is something that I would avoid if I could. I would not encourage you to get an S model unless you absolutely think you need one, unless you're really not going to be doing a whole lot of intense off-road stuff. If you're not going to be jumping anything or running over any intense obstacles that you want to be able to clear, maybe it's not a big deal. And actually, speaking of the underside of this bike and scraping it on things, if you guys have not heard, along with that doohickey and the Thermobob mod, the other thing, actually, the thing that I recommend the most on this bike, I guess maybe, now probably even before crash bars, the drain plug on these bikes, especially with the stock skid plate, literally hangs down about, I think it's got to be 3/4 of an inch, if not almost an inch. It's a very long drain plug, and I would definitely recommend switching that out as soon as you can for a low profile drain plug. They have the Tusk drain plug. I think there are some other ones out there. Again, there'll be links for all my parts down in the description. If you guys use those links, it doesn't cost you anything extra, but it's actually the only thing that allows me to do this right now. So I really appreciate when you guys take the time to click on those links before you buy any sort of motorcycle gear on Rocky Mountain ATV. But that is definitely one that I recommend really to anybody. I think we've already gone over most of the sort of design flaws that these bikes come with, but there is one that I think is honestly my biggest pet peeve when it comes to this bike. The stock shift lever and the stock foot peg are so close together that if you're going to ride this bike with a set of boots that is appropriate for not only the style of the bike, but also the weight of the bike, and is going to give you a decent amount of protection, you're not actually able to even get your foot in there decently to shift the bike. And I only wear a size 10 boot, so if your foot is any bigger than that or even a little bit smaller, you're probably also going to have a problem. So you really need to get the shift lever switched out for something a little bit longer, or you need to move the pegs further back or further down. The other issue, and actually probably something that's even more upsetting about this bike, and that's specifically the Gen 3, is that they tried to rubber isolate the foot peg brackets, and they also, of course, still just had the rubberized foot pegs, which are just an absolutely tragic thing to have off-road. For one thing, the pegs droop down and are also rubber, so when your feet are wet, they immediately slip off of them. It's a terribly unsafe situation if you're going to ride in terrain like that, and it's definitely something that I would suggest switching out. I switched mine out for the non-damped J&S lowering brackets. I hope eventually they will do a lowered rear set version of the non-damped peg brackets, simply so you don't have to run the extended shift lever. I've already dropped this thing and knocked my shift lever into the case. And the reason being is essentially there's a section cut out of that case for the stock lever to sort of fit in. And if you go past that, well, then you're knocking into the part of the engine that sticks out a little bit farther, so it's not really a good situation, and definitely something that I would avoid. It is a little bit annoying that this bike does not have a tachometer like the Gen 2 did. It's also kind of annoying that it didn't have a temperature gauge initially. I guess I don't know if that was intentional, so nobody was calling in asking why their bike was running completely cold and would never heat up. I don't know if they actually got those calls, but I can't imagine that they didn't. It seems like they've sort of gone as simple as possible with the dash, and honestly, I don't know if that's really a mistake. I think if you're buying this bike, you're sort of looking for simplicity, or I guess if you're not, you definitely should be, because that's exactly what you're gonna get. You can buy the adventure model with a few extra electrical doodads on it, but if you guys have seen the videos of the installs and stuff that I did with both these lights, the heated grips, the 12-volt port, it's really, really pretty easy to do. All the wiring is already there. You don't really have to have a whole lot of electrical knowledge to simply tap into it. Again, I've got videos on all that stuff. There's probably even easier ways of doing a lot of it than I did. But if you are looking at the adventure model thinking, it's worth it. It's got those crash bars. It's got those auxiliary lights. It's got those hard cases on the back. It's got, the racks and everything already set up. I can just get on it and go. It's got the charger. It'll be great. I think you'll be extremely disappointed. I know there are people out there that bought the adventure model that are happy, but if you are really looking to take this bike on some real adventures, I think the adventure model is the worst possible option in the entire lineup. If you want something that's really going to be able to take a fall off-road, the stock crash bars are going to do just about nothing for you. I'm pretty sure they bend like licorice. The handguards definitely need to be swapped out. You don't get anything special with the adventure model anyways. These auxiliary lights I have wired in direct to the high beam switch, so I don't even have to reach or fumble for a switch when there's oncoming traffic. All I have to do is flip my high beam switch back off and those lights shut down. It's so smooth. It's really not that hard to wire up. I've heard that the rear cases are crap. They don't take a fall at all. They'll immediately shatter. Same thing with the lights. I'm pretty sure those are plastic. These are aluminum and, plastic. But I think these are definitely going to take a beating much better than the stock adventure lights would. The bars are obviously much higher and much, much better built. They attach to each other in the middle here, so they sort of work off each other. You have all of the points on one side helping you along with the attachment points on the opposite side. It's just a much better way, I think, to go about protecting a bike. Same thing with the rear. I think soft bags are definitely the way to go, at least for me anyways. And if they're not for you, there are definitely a lot of other great aftermarket options out there that I think are going to be a lot better down the road for you than the factory aftermarket accessories are. Now, this next part, I was really kind of hesitant to even put in this video because it's really something that doesn't bother me that much anymore, and it's something that I think you can really get used to. But a lot of people will bypass the clutch safety switch on here to trick the bike into thinking that the clutch is just always pulled in, because without this mod, the fueling of the bike is, well, sort of odd. It's definitely not what you'd expect from a Gen 2. The RPMs jump and dive depending on whether the clutch is pulled in or not, and this bike has some pretty intense engine braking depending on the RPM that you're at and the speed that you're at and gear and everything. It's definitely something that I think you'll notice. I don't know if it's worth the sort of dangerous situation that you can put yourself or others in by doing the bypass mod. I mean, it's really not a great idea, in my opinion. The fueling definitely could use some updating, but I think doing that electronically through the ECU would be a much better way. Now, one of the first things that I noticed about this bike after I purchased it that really drove me nuts until I figured it out was the squeaky plastics. And I think if you even just take the plastics off and then put them back on again, honestly, it might sort of clean that squeak up. It was one of these fasteners down here, just needed to suck the fairing a little bit tighter to its mounting point. Otherwise, it sort of just kind of squeaked along as you went bouncing on down the trail. Other than that, I really have only had to adjust the headlight because it was pointing at the trees like it seems like 99% of other KLRs that are sold out there. I don't know what the deal with that is. I've done a lot of mods to this bike to make it fit my riding style and make it perform the way that I needed to off-road. But there really hasn't been anything else that I've had to do this bike. Now, as far as the vibrations go, I do have some stuff to kind of make the bike maybe a little bit worse, and then I've also done a few things to kind of make it a little bit better. I think having the fat bar and having my really squishy, thick, pillowy grips on here has kind of helped make the bars a little bit less vibey. In fact, I actually took the bar end weights off of these Barkbusters and stuck them on my 701 because that bike, it seems to have a little bit more of a buzz in the bars, where this one really, it doesn't seem to bother me too much now at all. And again, I don't know that if that's really the bars themselves or if it's the grips or if it's all of it together, but it's really not bad. The foot pegs, if you're going to be running faster than 70 miles an hour on the highway, and you have the same peg setup that I do, which again, I definitely recommend, you might notice a little bit of buzzing, but honestly, if you're not hugging the tank on this thing while accelerating, it's really not that much more vibey at 70 miles an hour than the Tenere 700 is. And a lot of people might be sort of looking at me sideways for that, but honestly, I really don't think so. And I guess maybe I should ask my dad to see what he thinks now that he's put some more miles on the Tenere since he's owned it. But I think any bike at that speed with a combustion engine running is going to have some vibration, especially with knobby tires like this. It's just something that's going to happen. I always get a lot of questions about riding with a passenger. I have actually never ridden with a passenger on this bike. Oddly enough, after you have 2 kids, you don't have a whole lot of time for just random motorcycle rides with your wife anymore. But with my Gen 2 and my wife on the back of that bike, I can't ever really say that I had too much of a problem. We never did any off-road riding that way, but it seemed good enough. She was plenty comfortable on it, a lot more comfortable than she was on my 2008 600RR or my CBR 600 F4. All of those bikes obviously are not really meant for a passenger. This one is, so it's not really a fair comparison, but that's all I really have to compare it to. I guess we did ride a few cruisers together, and I suppose this really is on par with those, if not maybe a little bit more enjoyable. I really like it for just cruising. It is fun to get on, but of course it's not going to have an exorbitant amount of power with 2 people on it. As far as touring on it with a bunch of luggage and camping gear for 2 people, I can't say that it's something, I guess, that I would recommend. I think there are better bikes out there for that type of riding than this. I think you could do it though. With all my gear loaded down on it, honestly, I was really pretty happy and pretty impressed. My dad and I ended up riding a ridiculous amount of time, both on the road and then off the road on some really nasty trails the first time that I took this bike out camping, and it really did a darn good job. Again, suspension maybe could have been a little bit better, but I really did enjoy riding this bike, and it's really been nothing but kind of a fun walk down memory lane, but also a just really enjoyable experience. And honestly, I mean, I will sit out in this garage and just look at this bike because it's just a cool looking motorcycle. I mean, it's maybe a little bit different from most of the adventure bikes out there today still, but it's getting close, and it's still, I don't know, it's just got its own look. It's just a cool bike. It's cool to ride. It's definitely a bike that has really changed me as a rider. I definitely expect different things out of bikes now because of this. And I think from a price standpoint and a capability standpoint, there are no other bikes out on the market today that can even come close to what this bike can offer. If, again, you're the right type of person, you have some off-road and on-road ambitions, and you realize that just because it's 650 cc's does not mean that it has a lot of power or that it's incredibly fast. Honestly, I think you would probably be just about as fast in most situations as a CRF 300 rally. It's just too heavy and doesn't have enough get up and go to really be a fast, mean bike. But that's the whole idea behind this bike, I guess, that's not what it is. It's about something else, and it's almost kind of hard to explain, honestly. I guess I really kind of summed it up, I guess, the only way that I know how when I did a comparison between this bike and my dad's T7. This bike is just cool. And if you don't understand that by the descriptions that I've made today or, you know, the things that I've gone over, I think you may never, and I think that's okay. I think there are a lot of other great bikes out there. There are a lot of great bikes that I cannot wait to put a leg over. And I think there are a lot of people out there that would really enjoy this bike, but like I said earlier, there are a lot of people that would not enjoy this bike. It would be much better throwing a leg over one of those other bikes. But if what I've said here does sound interesting to you, I think this bike is an amazing first adventure bike. I think it's definitely worth looking at. I think it is worth upgrading. It is worth keeping. And it's a bike that I've really enjoyed riding, and I'm definitely going to miss it. And I'm going to be selling the KLR 650. I know a lot of you will probably be upset about that, and I'll get millions of comments about how I'm ruining my channel by selling this bike. So many followers are going to leave. and that is actually kind of by design. I have been a KLR channel for far too long. If you guys are unaware, I have actually left my 40-hour-a-week engineering job about a year ago now, and have sort of transitioned to doing a side business that is sort of still in my old field, but also spending as much time, not nearly enough time as I should, on adventure motorcycles and dual sport riding and making videos. And that's what I intend to do, but I can't do that being a KLR channel for my whole life or the whole life of my channel. So I'm gonna be moving on from this bike. I will be selling it. I have had an excellent time riding this thing, and I'm really gonna have a hard time letting it go. I don't quite know how I'm gonna do it. I think it is gonna be a bit of a challenge. I guess I'm just gonna have to get something else, and hopefully that will sort of take my mind off of this and I can get rid of it. But boy, is it gonna be hard to get rid of, because it has just been an excellent bike. I often think back to the first time that I rode this bike, which was immediately after I picked it up from the dealer. I took it off-road and rode it, and it was just such a great experience. And it's really been a great experience ever since, and I honestly maybe just never gave it enough of a chance, but I've just never really had the same connection with the 10RA 700 that I did with my Gen 2 or that I do now with my Gen 3. I don't know, I think it's just something about that single cylinder thump. Like I said, it's just cool. So thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this video was helpful to you. If it was, let me know down in the comments section. Let me know what type of bike you think I should pick up next, and what your aspirations are for a KLR 650, and whether or not I talked you into or out of one of these bikes. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Stay safe. Stay swanky. Get out. Enjoy this beautiful world any chance you get. And if you can't do that right now, here's some more videos to check out in the meantime.